Greetings. Today's webinar is entitled A Tale of Two Countries, Honduras and Nicaragua Face the Shock Doctrine. The webinar is part of an ongoing monthly series founded and organized by Nan McCurdy and myself. My name is Barbara Larkham, and I'm your moderator today. I'm the coordinator of the Casa Baltimore Limay Friendship Project, which has been working in Nicaragua for nearly 37 years. Regrettably, the original version of this webinar presented on September 25th, 2022 was not recorded because of a technical glitch. The five of us who are speaking today on October 4th have gathered to record a new version, similar but not identical to the original. One significant difference is that Jim Phillips is with us today. Jim was unable to join us the first time. We've all made this extra effort because we believe the information we're sharing is important. We want to thank the Alliance for Global Justice for hosting our webinar series for the past 2 years. We're grateful that AFGJ will continue as one of our co-sponsors as we explore other hosting alternatives and platforms for future programs. And now I'm going to share a few announcements before we begin the regular program, and I need to share my screen for a moment. Okay. To stay up to date with other events and issues in Nicaragua, you can sign up for the NicaNet email list, which is a Google Group moderated list for people who support Nicaragua's progress and sovereignty. You can also sign up for Nica Notes, which includes a weekly article by an invited author, followed by news updates of the week. Do this at Alliance for Global Justice website, afgj.org. Several ebooks about Nicaragua are also available at the same website, afgj.org, free in English and Spanish, downloadable in several formats. If you'd like to become more active in supporting Nicaragua's sovereignty and opposing U.S. interference there, you're invited to join our Nicaragua Advocacy Network, working to spread more accurate information about what's really happening in Nicaragua. Please email the network if you'd like to join. The email address is Nicaragua Advocacy Network, all one word, at gmail.com. The next meeting is on Monday, October 17th at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Okay, now for the next slide. The next webinar in our series will compare Nicaragua with several other countries, including the UK and the US, on the concept of democracy as related to elections in each country. Confirmed speakers so far are Margaret Kimberly of Black Agenda Report and Graham Russell of Rights Action. It will take place 1 week before Nicaragua's municipal elections. So please mark your calendars for Sunday, October 30th for this webinar at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, 1 p.m. Nicaragua time, 7 p.m. in the UK. A registration link will be sent out soon. Now I want to end. Okay. Now we turn to today's webinar, which will be roughly 90 minutes in length. The format is as follows. First, we'll have news updates from Nan McCurdy, and then each of our featured speakers will have about 15 minutes. Afterward, we will address many of the questions previously posed by people in our audience on September 25th. So to begin, I'm pleased to introduce Nan McCurdy with news briefs. Nan is the editor of the online weekly, Nica Notes. She works for the United Methodist Church in the state of Puebla, Mexico, in projects of community-based health, sustainable agriculture, and community development. She lived in Nicaragua for over 30 years and continues to have deep connections there. Nan McCurdy, you have the floor.
Thank you, Barbara. It's great to be with you. I only have a few news briefs today because we have 3 excellent speakers and I don't want to take too much time. So Nicaragua continues to be the safest country in Central America. A study published by US magazine Insight Crime states that with a homicide rate of 5.7 per 100,000 inhabitants, Nicaragua continues to be the safest country in Central America and the 3rd safest in Latin America, surpassed only by Peru and Chile. The government is still covering all price increases in fuel and cooking gas. The Sandinista government will continue to cover the increases in fuel and cooking gas. This policy began in March. Through the Bismarck-Martinez program, 50,000 lots are being given to families in 2022. 15,000 families are also receiving homes. There is a new credit program for thousands of producers. The government announced the Adelante program, which will provide loans to thousands of people. It is a highly relevant program for production and development of small businesses. It will have an impact on the popular economy. It is part of a continuous effort to bring credit to thousands of small producers who contribute to development, said the Minister of Finance, Ivan Acosta. These sectors guarantee better distribution of income, access to production, to markets and financing, added Acosta. Since 2007, we have mobilized millions of dollars that have had an impact on production, trade, and consumption with very good results. The Adelante program will have a portfolio of up to $80 million for agriculture, livestock, forestry, fishing, aquaculture, manufacturing, agribusiness, commerce, hotels, restaurants, transportation, among others. The Pan American Health Organization reported that with 89.4% of the population fully vaccinated against COVID-19, Nicaragua is the country in Central America with the highest percentage of fully vaccinated people, followed by Costa Rica with 81.6%. This achievement is possible thanks to the efficacy of the community health model, with permanent vaccination, house-to-house visits, health fairs, mobile brigades, among other strategies. Nicaragua is on schedule for 99.9% electricity coverage. The National Electricity Company presented the Program for Sustainable Electrification and Renewable Energy report corresponding to the period between January 3rd and August 31st of this year. The report states that national electricity coverage has reached 99.2% and is on pace to achieve the goal of 99.9% projected for this year. Between January and August of this year, $26.5 million was invested in 164 electricity projects. Thank you so much. Back to you, Barbara.
Thank you, Nan. And now I'm pleased to introduce our first speaker, Jennifer Atlee. Jenny coordinates the Friendship Office of the Americas, which fosters solidarity among the peoples of Nicaragua, Honduras, and the United States. Its Honduras Accompaniment Project works alongside the Honduran nonviolent social movement. She lived in Central America for several decades and wrote a book, Red Thread, A Spiritual Journey of Accompaniment, Trauma, and Healing. which chronicled her experiences in the Contra war zones of Nicaragua. Welcome, Jenny Atlee. The floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Barbara and Nan. As we were preparing for this webinar today and this opportunity to look at these two coups, the tale of these two coups, there were so many paths to take, ways to go about approaching them. But it seemed that core to what happened in both Honduras and Nicaragua was that these were shocking, fast-moving, and confusing events, and that the US was a driver in both situations. So in thinking about it, we felt that a really helpful frame for looking at both of these experiences is the work of Naomi Klein around shock doctrine, because that shock doctrine is a through line in both of these stories. Naomi Klein talks about Latin America always being a laboratory for this doctrine, which is a strategy based on using traumatic shock to create a window of opportunity that is then exploited to do regime change and introduce a set of policies, neoliberal policies, which she calls shock therapy. She also talks about the state of shock being a time when there's a gap between very fast-moving events and the information that exists to explain those events. And that in that gap, there's a pre-prepared narrative that's pumped in. But she also talks about that once the mechanics of shock doctrine are deeply and collectively understood, then communities can become more shock resistant. And so in this webinar, we're going to look at both of these coups and really looking as US citizens, how can we deepen our collective understanding about the US role in these shocking events so that we can better talk about them, organize around them, and be in better solidarity and be more shock resistant. So these both coups emerge from historical context and relations with the United States. So historic memory about US intervention is really an important component of being shock resistant. For many of us, our background comes from Nicaragua and being in Nicaragua in the 1980s and our work in the war zones, where we saw both the beauty of the revolution and the horror of the US-sponsored war that was trying to destroy it. And although the US couldn't destroy it militarily or through economic embargo, the elections in 1990 did provide an opportunity to deliver a shock via a public threat that the US made to a war-weary people who'd been terrorized for 10 years. And the threat said, choose between your collective dream, this revolution, or more war and violence and terror. And the US had funded and backed an opposition party. And in that 1990 election, the results were shocking. And they were the result of a deliberate use of terror and trauma to impact the outcome of an election. It was effectively a regime change operation. It opened the country to neoliberal policies for the next 16 years. But opposition continued to build to those policies, not only in Nicaragua, but all through Central America and South America, where US policy and neoliberalism was the guiding policy. And then there was a period of pushback. And so progressive governments started to be elected in Venezuela, in Bolivia, in Ecuador, Argentina. 2007, the FSLN comes back into office, into government in Nicaragua. And Manuel Zelaya is in power in Honduras. And these countries are now forming economic blocs, of which the US is not a part. Where they can coordinate and be in solidarity and support each other. So there's ALBA and there's Petrocaribe. At this time, the US was also overextended in Iraq and Afghanistan. And then we started to hear US Southern Command, Southcom, talking about the need to reassert US power in Latin America and take the region back. And then in June of 2009, there is a military coup in Honduras. And that coup sent shockwaves throughout the region and the world. How is this possible? How could this ever happen again? And it produced a national and international outcry and determination that that coup needed to be reversed, that constitutional order needed to be restored, and that that kind of a dangerous precedent could not be allowed to stand. It generated sustained massive protest in Honduras. And but the US intervened in a consistent way to legitimize and lock in that coup. I remember with our accompaniment team in 2010, saying amongst ourselves, once it became clear that this coup was going to stand, we need to learn from this because they will do this in Nicaragua. And fast forward 2018, then we see a coup attempt in Nicaragua. So in looking at similarities and differences in these two stories, one of the big differences is the outcome. In Honduras, the outcome of the coup was 13 years of continuismo, which is the continuation of the coup regime, and the delivery of shock therapy. So privatizations, concessioning of resources, territory, zedes, all of that generated nonviolent resistance to those policies, and that was met with violent state repression. It generated systemic abuse of human, social, economic, and environmental rights, the exodus of a large portion of the population, and what the Hondurans refer to as the long Honduras night, just an abysmal situation of fear and terror. It was finally reversed in November of 2021 through the election of President Xiomara Castro, and because of the efforts, sustained efforts of the Honduran people to reverse that coup. But the mechanics of the shock doctrine are still very much intact. Just recently, President Castro was at the UN addressing the UN General Assembly, and she spoke of the wreckage that was left in the wake of that coup and spoke about the complicity of the international community in allowing that to happen. And in Nicaragua, the outcome was very different. The government was able to repel the coup relatively quickly, given the gravity of it, and then moved and is working to dismantle the mechanics of shock doctrine. Why is such a different outcome? In part, there's a very different history of the United States in each country and relations with each country. So in Nicaragua, where there was a revolution and there was deep structural change, the repressive forces of the former dictator, US-backed dictator, were dismantled, and new structures were formed with a different vision of their role and relationship with society. And then as the revolution continued to meet and address the basic needs of the poor, internal solidarity, which is something that Jim Phillips will talk about more, continued to be very strong. And there was also historically a strong solidarity movement, international solidarity movement with Nicaragua. In Honduras, it's a very different situation. I always say read Jim Phillips' books for the best information, but in a nutshell, Honduras for the US has been a military, economic, and intelligence hub in the region. It's the platform from which it coordinates its counterinsurgency wars in the past. US has military bases in Honduras. It has a very close relationship with the state security forces, which it funds and trains. It created death squads within those forces during the 1980s that targeted social movements and pacified efforts for social change. Those are still intact. It's a very militarized country, and there wasn't a very strong solidarity movement with the US. So those differences were key in the different outcomes of these two coups in both countries. In terms of similarities, in both cases, the events were very shocking. There was a spark, there was some event that was exploited to deliver the shock. There was a gap between very fast-moving events and the information that existed to explain them. There was the use of terror and violence to destabilize and confuse and keep that gap open. There was a media strategy in place to demonize the leader to be overthrown and plant the State Department narrative for why this was necessary. And there was also blacking out of facts that contradicted that policy. There was an advocacy strategy in both cases to get US Congress on board with the plan, the coup attempt, and to assure funding. There were networks in place in both cases of nonprofit organizations, think tanks, policy organizations, North and South, that would support the narrative and the strategy. There were US funding in place, directly and indirectly, to support these networks and these strategies. In retrospect, we can see how the groundwork was laid in advance and how the mechanics of it were put in place before the shocking events happened. In Honduras, the narrative was that Zelaya was a dangerous thugocrat and wanted to change the constitution to run for re-election. And the spark was the Constituente, a non-binding opinion poll to consult the population about their desire or not to have a constituent assembly. And this was a demand of social movements. But on the eve of those ballots going out, that's when the coup happened. And what the coup organizers didn't foresee was this massive eruption of sustained nonviolent protest that the Honduran people sustained for months and months, and really throughout the entire 13 years. And that was brutally repressed in the first few months for all the world to see. Massive repression, except that no one saw because it never made headlines. There was a media blackout on it. No matter how bad the human rights situation got, no matter how bad the repression was, it wasn't covered. And then going on through the coup in the subsequent 13 years, that human rights situation, the violent repression, the drug trafficking, the fraudulent elections, again, were not covered. And it was not a concern for the US. For the US, headlines were that Honduras was open for business. There was a positive investment climate. Honduras was the #1 ally of the US in the region, #1 partner in the war on drugs, and the State Department certified Honduras on human rights year after year for those 13 years. In Nicaragua, at the same time, in 2009, the narrative was that Ortega was a repressive dictator, that there was a human rights nightmare in Honduras, that in Nicaragua, that Nicaragua was part of a troika of tyranny, and that it was the biggest threat to Central America, and that there were fraudulent elections. This narrative never leaves headlines. It keeps circulating even now. And at this time in 2009, leading up to 2018, when the coup attempt happened in Nicaragua, we were traveling back and forth and living in both countries, in Nicaragua, in Honduras. And what was so shocking was how this dominant narrative did not match reality in either case, and that actually the headlines for Nicaragua were more appropriate for Honduras. But this all worked in Washington, and that's the reality that was constructed, and it wasn't questioned. And in both cases, the groundwork for the coups and the ongoing intervention were led by the same cohort of extreme right-wing politicians in Congress. And And in Nicaragua, another difference was that while the coup did get massive coverage in mainstream, and they did cover the protests, they did make headlines, even though those protests ultimately were not sustained, and there was violence, and they were armed, and they did damage infrastructure, that did make headlines, but it didn't in Honduras. And so where we are now, in terms of US, is that the US did recognize Xiomara Castro as the president, but the US also has a plan for Honduras, which it has announced and rolled out, which is more of the neoliberal policy agenda, and has dictates for who Honduras can have relationships with. So in Xiomara Castro at the UN and our partners in Honduras both have said they're very aware that the threat of another coup looms large in Honduras. They're very aware that the current ambassador to Honduras was the ambassador to Nicaragua in 2018 and during the period preparatory to the coup attempt in 2018. So things are very tense in Honduras right now. In Nicaragua, the elections in 2021 posed another opportunity for destabilization. The elections were delegitimized before they even happened in Congress. Sanctions have been applied. Nicaragua continues to make headlines in terms of being a dictatorship and continues to be a target of regime change. A big difference is in Honduras, there was a solidarity movement that grew through the experience of the coup and is still in place today. In Nicaragua, that historic solidarity movement was fractured, and that was very shocking. And I think that's something that we need to learn about, and hopefully this webinar helps to learn about these two coups and to strengthen our solidarity moving forward. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jenny, for your insightful presentation. And now we'll hear from the next speaker, Dr. James J. Phillips. Jim is the author of a couple of books that I'll mention: Honduras in Dangerous Times, Resistance and Resilience, published in 2015, and the recently published book entitled Extracting Honduras, Resource Exploitation, Displacement, and Forced Migration. This is a book that details the frenzied U.S. extraction of Honduran natural resources and the many negative results. He has also written about Nicaragua, where he lived for several years during the Contra War and has visited many times since. Jim Phillips, you have the floor.
Thank you, Barbara. I want to pick up on this question of the economy and the extraction of resources. I think there's a central argument to be made on this, that that extraction is a core, one of the core things to understanding what's happening in Honduras and Nicaragua and the difference in the two. Extractive development is something that has been around in Latin America since the time of the Spaniards, and it is based and still based upon things like mining, forestry, logging, plantation agriculture, all of which extract the resources of a country to send them abroad and to use the people of a country as workers, as dependent workers on these, in the mines, plantations, etc. The Spaniards started this in the 1500s, and that sort of structure continues today in terms of the extractivism of Latin America. The myth that goes along with this in the Spanish time was the myth of El Dorado, the city of gold. And the modern version of that is that the countries of Latin America and countries like Honduras and Nicaragua are wealthy countries basically because they have wealth of resources that can be exploited and a ready population that is willing to work on them, to work for foreign interests. And so this is a city of gold in the sense that, wealth can be taken from these countries. This is basically an imperial colonial situation, and it continues today under the guise of development and extractive development, neoliberal development. The problem with this, of course, is that both the neoliberal kind of conservative governments of Latin America and the so-called progressive, more socialist-oriented governments are all susceptible to this myth, to this idea. But they go about it in very different ways, and that's part of what differentiates Honduras from Nicaragua. So I want to take a little look at that, of the kind of political economy of these two countries briefly, to kind of point out the difference between the two in the way that they extract resources and why they do so. In Honduras, there are many foreign companies. It is open for business, as Jenny said. Canada is the major mining interest in Honduras. It has more mines than anybody else. The US, China, European countries also mine in Honduras. Mining in Honduras has been an important basis of wealth for the elite in the country for a long time, for at least 100 years, probably longer. More recently, fruit companies were introduced in the early 1900s and become another source of wealth for Hondurans and for foreign interests as well. So we have now in Honduras mining, exploit agriculture, plantation agriculture, and forestry. Logging is also now an important major form of extraction in Honduras, and logging in Honduras is one of the major covers for drug trafficking. Drug traffickers use illegal and illegal logging as the cover. I won't go into details about how that happens, but it's another way that wealth is extracted from the country. The thing about Honduras is that the government, after the 2009 coup that Jenny talked about, the new government, the post-coup governments that had deposed Zelaya, began to return to this extractive model with a vengeance. And what they basically did was finally grant concessions. In the few years after the coup in Honduras, approximately a third of the country's total landmass was under concessions by the Honduran government to foreign and some Honduran economic interests for mining primarily, and some other projects as well, extractive projects. So this is what happened, and today our extractive industries include all of these things. The 2009 coup eliminated Zelaya, who was a problem for that. But it's what's important today about this extractive regime is that in Honduras, the government has abandoned local communities to the predations of foreign corporations, mining companies, logging companies, plantation agriculture. So when a mining corporation or a large-scale landowner who wants to increase his land for farming, for plantation agriculture, when they want to move into the territory of a local rural community or peasant farming group, the government not only does not intervene in that, but it may actually does usually support the larger interests, the extractive interests. The result of that, as I detailed in one of my books, is that we now have a situation where thousands or hundreds at least of small communities all over Honduras in the past 15 years or more have been displaced by large-scale extractive industries. And the people of these displaced communities now have to find work somewhere else. They can no longer support themselves on their land, and they are turned into dependent job seekers in large part. Some of them find work on plantations or working for some of these large corporations. And many of them have flocked to cities in Honduras, which have grown, cities like San Pedro, which have grown enormously. And what we see after years of this is a population of poor people living in cities in Honduras and becoming poorer and poorer, more and more dependent, trying to find jobs that are not there really, or jobs that pay nothing. And their children grow up in poverty and very susceptible to gangs and to violence and to drug trafficking and all of the rest of it. So, and that is a major cause of the emigration from Honduras that we've seen in huge numbers today. As many of 100,000 people, anywhere from 60 to 100,000 people each year flee Honduras because of that situation. And the root of it, in large part, has to do with this extractive model that Honduras has pursued. But the point about that, of course, is that the government sides with the extractivists, not with the local communities. And so the new government, the result today of this, is that the poverty rate in Honduras, the current poverty rate is about 73%, and may even go up a little higher. A little bit, that's due to COVID, but a lot of it isn't. So the new government of Xiomara Castro, who came into power this past January, has been working on trying to reform this. And from what I understand from her platform and what we've seen, they are committed, the new government is committed to changing this model of development, to shifting it over much more away from foreign extractive industry into something that will have returns for the people, and to promote small scale industry, small scale businesses, local communities, local farming communities, and return the resources to the people to be much more self-reliant again, which is basically to reverse this model. Which of course leads us to Nicaragua, which is exactly where that model, this model is taking place. In Nicaragua, the political economy is not one of extraction of foreign interests. It is primarily one, at least the theory of it is primarily one to promote the self-reliance of a country and to return the profits from whatever extraction occurs, to return those profits to the people of the country in the form of social services and supports. The Adelante program, which I think was mentioned earlier, is an example of that kind of thing. Nicaragua has never been a place that has not been a country in which the elite has derived most of its power and wealth from mining, but it has a lot of logging and a lot of agricultural interests in the past. And the wealth of the Somoza dictatorship was built in large part on the agricultural plantation economy, which turned a lot of people basically into slave labor. The 1979 revolution, which brought in the Sandinista revolution, brought the promise of land and a very different model that would use the resources of the country to finance the wealth, to finance the product, the self-reliance of communities. And so Nicaragua, what happened after the revolution is that Nicaragua faced the cold reality that it did need to generate wealth. The country needed wealth, and it could not afford to just entirely turn over the entire country to small farming. There was a big argument or discussion, I guess, or disagreement at the time of the revolution about how to do this. What we have, the result of that, in some sense, it's a kind of a mixed economy in Nicaragua, where there were government farming, government state farms. Some private industry was allowed and functioned, export industries, and all together with the expansion of cooperatives and land grants to rural communities that within land that had been taken from the Somoza elite when they fled. So this has been the economy, and what it does is try to balance the need to generate income from abroad with the needs to take that income and support and fund the social programs that will benefit the people of Nicaragua. The difference with the Honduran economy is that in Nicaragua, whatever extractive industries there are regulated in some sense by the government. So the government of Nicaragua does not simply allow foreign corporations to run amok the country and to discard the human rights and basic rights of rural communities. If there are conflicts, as there have been in the Atlantic coast and in some areas, the conflicts are mediated by the government, and so that there's a fair distribution and that the rights and territory and resources of small communities are protected from private interests that would invade them. And that is a major difference with the Honduran model, where that's not true. How is Nicaragua fund all of these social programs? Well, in part, they've received money, of course, from ALBA, from the ALBA, the alternative to the Alliance for Progress, the United States funding. So the Nicaraguan government has financed these social projects partly because they received aid from ALBA over the years, but also because they've developed a reputation. The Nicaraguan government has developed a reputation for transparency, for efficiency, for accountability in the use of loans and grants that it received from foreign aid organizations, foreign interests, foreign economic and development agencies. And so this model that Nicaragua has funded has resulted in a country that now produces more than 90% of its own food that it consumes for its own people. It's a model that moves to self-sufficiency, self-reliance on the people of the country rather than on the foreign corporations to generate wealth and stability for the country. I want to mention briefly, though, so the difference here, we have a problem because each country has right now a dilemma. The Xiomara Castro government's dilemma is that because of the 12 or 14 years of previous governments, the country is basically broke because of doesn't have money, needs the money, and the United States is still a major source of open for business, wanting to finance all kinds of development in Honduras. So it is the Honduran government is under great pressure to accept the terms of the U.S. development, U.S. funding, which means that the Honduran government is in a dangerous position right now, wanting to change the model of development, but unable to do so as long as it cannot generate the funds to do that. And the way that funds are involved comes from places like the United States that have an interest in keeping that going. The Nicaraguan dilemma is different because in Nicaragua, as Jenny says, what the government has pushed, the sanctions against Nicaragua are meant to, and the drastic measures that are taken against, in Nicaragua have been meant to prevent the Nicaraguan government from generating the funds it needs and using the funds it needs to finance its own social programs and thereby to create discontent among the people. In both cases, the issue is to create discontent among the people of these two countries so that internal solidarity is fractured. In the case of Nicaragua, as Jenny mentioned, external solidarity of Nicaragua has also been fractured in the past few years through the use of media. Let me just, as a close, I'll mention the way in which the media have been used to distort the story of Nicaragua. One, by the use of false and distorted facts of what's going on in Nicaragua. Two, by the total lack of historical and social context that would create a context for understanding the country and what's happening. And by the narrow manipulation of terms like democracy and human rights that can be manipulated and narrowly interpreted to mean nothing but democracy, then is nothing but elections, the holding of elections, and has nothing to say about, you know, the way that people participate in the popular decisions that are made in the country. So these three ways are the ways in which our media, the international media and the US media, have tried to create a false narrative about Nicaragua. I think I'm going to have to stop there. There's a lot more to say, but thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Well, maybe you can add some more during our question and answer period. That was very enlightening. Our final speaker today is John Perry, who has lived and worked in Masaya, Nicaragua for the last 19 years. He's been writing about Honduras since the 2009 coup, and he currently focuses on the contradictions in U.S. policy towards Central America, especially Nicaragua. He's been published in a number of journals, including The Nation, London Review of Books, Council on Hemispheric Affairs, or COHA, and Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, or FAIR. Welcome, John Perry. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Barbara. I hope I can share the screen with you. And I'm going to start off with a map. I'm a town planner by profession, so that is appropriate to start with a map, just to show the difference, the geographical difference between Honduras and Nicaragua. Nicaragua is slightly larger in size, but rather smaller in population. Honduras is about 50% bigger in population terms. But they share the dubious distinction of being the two poorest countries in Latin America after Haiti. And as we've heard, Honduras has had neoliberal governments continuously until now, except for that brief period when Manuel Zelaya changed the narrative before 2009. And in Nicaragua, there's been a Sandinista government from 1979 to 1990, and for the last 15 years, since 2007. And of course, both countries rejected neoliberalism in the elections last November. I want to compare or start by comparing the situation in the two countries at around the same time. Nicaragua in 2007, when the Sandinistas returned to power, and Honduras in 2009, when Mel Zelaya left power due to the coup that we've heard about. So after 16 years of neoliberal government in Nicaragua, public spending on health was only 2.8% to 2.8% of GDP. The Ortega government inherited a broken health system. There were few facilities in rural areas. 3 million people were without access to piped water. Poverty was running at practically half the population, extreme poverty at 17%. In Honduras, there'd been some improvement in the situation led by the Zelaya government by 2009. A gradual recovery from the Hurricane Mitch, which had devastated Honduras even more than Nicaragua in 1998. Life expectancy had increased, infant mortality had fallen, public spending had peaked at 4% of GDP. There were 28 public hospitals, but coverage was still very poor, and poverty had fallen, and extreme poverty had fallen. What I'm going to talk about is looking at the issues that Jim and Jenny talked about in general, by specific reference to how the two countries tackled COVID. And to set the context for that, I want to talk about the events in the two countries after 2007 in the case of Nicaragua and 2009 in the case of Honduras. In Nicaragua, the new government started a massive investment program. So it had the highest regional growth in GDP for several years. By 2022, the government had built 24 new hospitals, and there'd been a 63% increase in health staff. By then, it had more hospital beds than Mexico or Colombia, two much richer countries, and had one of the highest public health spending levels in Latin America. And all the services were now free again. They'd been, many of them being charged for under the neoliberal governments, and they're now open to everyone as well. But these services and other services were targeted in the 2018 coup attempts that both Jim and Jenny have mentioned. Health services, health centres and ambulances were destroyed. People died at the violent roadblocks because they couldn't get to hospital. The health minister, who would be responsible for this massive improvement in health services, was personally sanctioned and is still to this day personally sanctioned by the US government. And we saw in Masaya, for example, the picture on the bottom right there shows you the devastation that was caused by violent thugs destroying public services and public facilities in 2018. I didn't have one handy of the health services that were disrupted in 2018, but this shows Masaya's refuse trucks, which were parked in a depot that was completely ransacked in June 2018. So to show a couple of these points graphically about what the achievements during that period, the chart on the left shows public spending on health as a proportion of GDP in Latin American countries. And as you can see, Nicaragua is towards the top, whereas Honduras currently is towards the bottom. And the figures I mentioned about hospitals, there's always some contention about what is a public hospital. But I think the chart on the right shows clearly that Nicaragua is well ahead in terms of public hospital provision compared with the rest of Central America, including wealthier countries like Costa Rica and Panama. Now, in contrast to that, in Honduras, in between 2010 and 2019, growth fell very low. It had the lowest growth in the region. There were no public hospitals built, and public health spending fell drastically. There was a very low level of hospital beds per 1,000 population when the pandemic hit in 2020. The national insurance scheme, on which many people relied on for their health services, was raided, with $300 million being taken out of it in 2013, and then more was robbed in 2015 to finance the then president's re-election campaign. And there were corrupt contracts within the service that led to things being unusable or dangerous. For example, like vaginal depositories that were filled with flour, and patients had to take to hospital everything that they needed. How did these two countries then cope with COVID when it arrived in 2020? Well, Nicaragua had prepared as early as January and February, published its plan to cope with the crisis. It tightened border controls, it imposed health checks at borders, it made follow-up visits to patients who started to get COVID. One hospital was devoted exclusively to COVID cases, and 18 others had specialist units created. All 36,000 health workers were trained for dealing with the pandemic. Health brigades began to make house-to-house visits to counter the misinformation that was being promoted about government's response to the pandemic. And a range of measures combined really were intended to allow the country to continue on without lockdowns, with the government deciding that lockdowns would be too devastatingly harmful to the economy, which, as Jenny and Jim have emphasised, depends very much on small businesses. But COVID was totally instrumentalised by the US administration, by the corporate media, and by local opposition media as a means for attacking the government. So the local media started to forecast huge numbers of cases and deaths that never materialised. The US government probably funded the setting up of the so-called Citizens Observatory to produce so-called real statistics on COVID that were based on social media reports and rumours. There were stories about midnight burials and mass graves, fake news about the effects of Russian and Cuban vaccines, and indeed many people were initially deterred from going to hospital. I put a picture of one of the main stories from the Washington Post in April 2020, where they and other media like the New York Times, the Guardian, BBC were saying that Daniel Ortega had disappeared in response to the pandemic, which was completely false. The government published its own strategy in a 75-page white paper in an attempt to silence its critics. And indeed, you can read this in both Spanish and English on the relevant websites. But that's failed to stem the tide of criticism. In Honduras, meanwhile, which was largely immune to international criticism, a disaster occurred. The government imposed tight lockdowns, school closures, and sometimes nighttime curfews. There were protests against this because people simply couldn't get a living, and people were even shot or imprisoned who were protesting. The depleted health service couldn't cope. This picture shows health workers protesting in the street. There was plentiful international aid, but there was widespread corruption in the use of that aid, faulty medical supplies, contracts going to the president's family. And perhaps the catalytic point about corruption during the pandemic was the purchase of 7 mobile hospitals, bought at a cost of $47 million, with a real value only less than a third of that. And most are still not operational even today. And on YouTube, you can find this video, Hospitales de Lata, in hospitals, which tells you the story of the corruption involved in buying these useless hospitals from Turkey. At the same time as the pandemic, both countries were hit by 2 violent hurricanes in November 2020. In Nicaragua, there were almost no deaths. People were evacuated and repairs were quickly put in hand. In Honduras, there was a total disaster on top of the disaster caused by the pandemic, with 6,000 homes destroyed, many others seriously damaged, and many people in temporary shelters months or even a year after the hurricane hit. And Médecins Sans Frontières said that the government's response was totally inadequate. How did the US respond to COVID-19 in both countries? Well, the US poured aid into Honduras. Initially, it got $8 million of assistance, it got test kits, ventilators, and it benefited hugely from the Biden promise of vaccines for Latin America. In contrast, hardly any aid went to Nicaragua, and none of it went to the government. No equipment, few vaccines, and those that were sent much later on. And at the same time, the US administration was ramping up sanctions on Nicaragua. So that when the vaccination campaign started in Nicaragua, it used vaccines from the international Covishield effort and from Russia and Cuba rather than from the US. And you can see here in this chart, this shows the aid that was given by the US to Latin American countries. And there's very much a focus on countries that are close to the US border, which is perhaps not entirely surprising. But you can see that Honduras is well up there, but Nicaragua is at the bottom. And Cuba and Venezuela would be at the bottom too, if they were shown on this chart. Nan mentioned in her introduction how well Nicaragua was doing in terms of vaccinations. And this is a chart from the end of August, showing Nicaragua well ahead in terms of Central American countries. And indeed is well ahead compared with the UK and the US, and is one of the most fully vaccinated countries in the world. So it had a slow start in getting vaccination going because of the shortage of supplies, but its community-based health system worked very effectively in getting through to people. And there is this culture of accepting vaccinations in Nicaragua, which worked very successfully. And of course, that's a product of the revolution and of the community health system. It's very difficult to get accurate figures on the effects of the pandemic on different countries, but there have been 3 attempts in the last few months to do so. The World Health Organization calculated the excess deaths due to COVID across different countries, and so did Amnesty International using a US think tank, and so did The Economist. And I've put on the chart on the slide a table, one each from each of those sources, and all of them show that Honduras had more excess deaths than Nicaragua, and indeed Nicaragua on many counts was one of the better performing countries in Latin America, and this is despite having no long lockdown, whereas almost all countries in Latin America had some kind of lockdown. So to summarize, we've got two different countries, two similar countries, but with rather different outcomes from the COVID pandemic. Nicaragua was one of the lowest excess death levels in Latin America. The economy suffered badly in 2018, as we've heard, and again in 2020 because of the pandemic, but in 2021 grew by over 10%. And the country, as Nan mentioned, has returned to previous levels of public safety. It has the lowest homicide rate in Central America and one of the lowest in the continent. And of course, the Sandinista government was re-elected in November 2021. In Honduras, half the population was living in poverty before 2020. It's now around 73 or 74%, as Xiomara Castro herself said at the UN the other day. Gross domestic product per head fell below that of Nicaragua. So Honduras is now the second poorest country in Latin America. Public debt is 6 times what it was before 2009. It's one of the most unequal countries in Latin America, as you can see from the chart. Brazil stands out as being unequal in Latin America. Honduras is almost as unequal. And Nicaragua, despite being one of the poorest countries, is in the middle of the chart rather than at the top. And as we know, the corrupt neoliberal governments in Honduras were defeated in November 2021, leaving an enormous task to Xiomara Castro and no corporate media recognition of what was achieved in neighboring Nicaragua during the COVID pandemic. I wanted to finish by just a little slide from our local hospital, which was one of the 19 equipped nationally to deal with COVID cases. The peak of COVID infection in Nicaragua occurred in May, June, July 2020. And at one time, there were 90 patients in the intensive care in the COVID unit. But numbers fell dramatically. And by August, the hospital was able to hold an event to thank staff and bring patients back to the hospital to celebrate the achievement of conquering COVID over that period. And this is a photograph of some of the doctors at that event to celebrate that achievement. So just to conclude with a reminder of the books that are on the AFGJ website about Nicaragua, and you can read a lot about the government's achievements and also look back at that horrible coup attempt in 2018 if you go to those reliable sources of AFJG. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And now we're going to move into our question and answer period. Okay, so Nan and I are going to alternate asking questions of the panel that were originally asked by our audience on September 25th. But since other people have not gotten to hear those answers yet through the recording, we're going to try again with this. Nan?
Sure. The first question, how do you explain how the corporate mass media functioned as an echo chamber of U.S. government framing of what happened in Honduras and Nicaragua? Certainly, there is ideological affinity between the media owners and political elites in the U.S., but was there also U.S. government funding for journalists, etc.? John Perry, would you like to take this question?
Thanks, Nan. I don't think we know whether there was US funding for journalists in the corporate media, in the international media. What we do know is there was US funding for journalists in Nicaragua, so that the Chamorro Empire, which has La Prensa and Confidencial in it. La Prensa has been receiving US government funding since the 1980s, and Confidencial for at least 15 years, probably longer. And some of the other opposition media in Nicaragua were receiving it too. And I think the proposition was that by feeding these media, which all had people who were skilled at communicating in English as well as Spanish, they would get the message across to the corporate media, to the New York Times, Washington Post, Guardian, BBC, etc. And that was very successful. All of those journalists, especially the ones that came here in 2018 to look at the coup attempt, were hosted by the opposition media. They were taken around. They were shown false events, false flag incidents like sniper shooting, and they duly reported all of those events in the Guardian, BBC, New York Times, and so on. Even people like John Anderson in the New Yorker, I think it is, you know, who one would have thought would have had a critical perspective on what he was being told, repeated these events very faithfully. So I don't know whether the US actually needed to fund the corporate media. They were so successful in getting them to use the local media as their source that this worked very well.
I would just add that to make sure people understand that millions and millions of dollars was funneled through USAID, NED, and other US organizations like those to Nicaraguan media, and not just to them, but to actually create Nicaraguan media since the Sandinistas came into power, you know, with the whole plan to be providing disinformation to the population. Barbara, back to you.
Okay. Here's a question that was placed in the chat on the 25th regarding Noam Chomsky's stand on Nicaragua, and asking also about former leaders of the FSLN like Dora Maria Tellez, who have been attacked by the current Nicaraguan leadership. I guess this is asking whoever would like to take this question to talk more about the fracturing that has happened both in Nicaragua and the support for Nicaragua in the US. Who would like to take that? Okay, Jim, unmute yourself, please.
There you are. Okay, I'll start with that, and then you can chime in here. It's been very clear. I mean, it's just kind of startling to me how the external solidarity here in the United States that was pretty strong in the 1980s for Nicaragua has fractured, and many of the people who were very strong supporters of the revolution in the 1980s in the United States and elsewhere are now, you know, toting a different line entirely. And I think that is in part the result of the confusion which the media, as John pointed out, the media have created that false narrative about Nicaragua. That is actually, you know, I think part of the issue here is the manipulation of terms like human rights and democracy, so that these terms are narrowed to their narrowest possible meaning, so that democracy means nothing but electoral politics, the government change, you know, and it doesn't have anything to do in that term with the larger issue of how people participate in their own decisions every day. You know, the political decisions of their country. They use the same tactic against countries like Cuba, you know, where democracy only means one thing, and that's the change of regime change, basically, has nothing to do with larger issues. Or the question of human rights. Whose rights are we talking about here? You know, the rights of people to subvert their government, or the rights of people to protect the government, to protect the country. You just have to be a little careful when you look at the media about not only who the sources are, but how they use terms like democracy and human rights, and even religious freedom for that matter. I could say a lot about that one, but in my own experience, but yeah.
John, I think you've had a lot to say about Dora Maria Tellez in the past. Do you care to share anything at this point?
Well, yes. one of the Dora Maria Tejas is one of the people that's most often flagged up by previous supporters of the Sandinista revolution as being someone who's now in prison. But the media have successfully hidden what she did during the coup attempt. I mean, she was here in Masaya actually handing out money and drugs and munitions to the people who were running the violent roadblocks. And she started doing this at the very beginning of the coup attempt on April the 18th. I spoke to a police source quite recently who confirmed that she was seen doing that on that day. She was one of the organisers, the biggest organisers of the violent coup attempt in 2018, and was knowingly feeding the violence that was taking place at those roadblocks when so many Sandinistas were kidnapped, tortured in some cases, and killed in other cases. I also wanted to mention, just to add to what Jim said, I think there's this terrible gap now in the media, which applies, I think, both in Honduras and in Nicaragua. That the media isn't really interested in the needs and desires of ordinary people. It gets the message about a country from the middle classes, the upper classes, the political elite. And in the case of Nicaragua, where there's a clear desire reflected in the election result for investment in public services, good hospitals, good roads, good social housing, good electricity coverage, good water supplies, all of the things that the Sandinista government has been delivering. That's what's important to people. And the imprisonments that took place last year haven't really attracted much attention in the country. It's not something that people talk about very much. What they want to know is, are their services getting better? And they are.
Nan?
Yes, I have another question. This one I think should be for Jenny to begin with, at least. What can people in the U.S. do to support the new government of Xiomara Castro in light of how much the U.S. will be ready to undermine, if not overthrow her?
Mm-hmm. I think the main thing that we can do is to be proactive, to really be educating ourselves, to be following what's happening, to be active before something happens, to already be talking about this, to be talking about U.S. interference and intervention and disrespect for sovereignty. And with our policymakers in our communities, at our churches, at our community organizations, we need to be explaining and talking about the fact that this is happening and that there is a risk, and talk about the positive things that are happening and the transition that Jim described that this government is trying to make with all of the challenges that it faces, and that transition needs to be safeguarded and not undermined, and that we want U.S. policy that respects those sovereign decisions and that doesn't intervene to create a different coup. So I think any way we can educate ourselves, organize, educate our communities, and do advocacy, be in touch with our policymakers proactively, starting now. That's the main thing. Also be in touch and build solidarity with Honduran organizations on the ground. Read them, be in conversation with them, be in solidarity, look for ways to participate, be in part of a delegation, to get the stories firsthand and bring them back to communities and policymakers. Those are a few things that I think of.
Thank you, Jenny.
Mm-hmm.
Back to you, Barbara.
There is a question about migration and how come there are more Nicaraguans now who are migrating to the United States? And can you compare that with migration from Honduras? I know this was covered a bit, but you could cover that a bit more. And I don't know who might wish to speak to that, either Jenny or Jim, perhaps.
I'll start that. I mentioned before that in the past 10, 12 years, at least past 4 or 5 years, the average annual rate of immigration from Honduras to the United States has been anywhere from 60 to 100,000 people. It's one of the figures that was relevant to this is an average of 300 people a day leaving Honduras to flee that country. The figures in Nicaragua, as I understand them, are much, much lower, even now. And there are some different circumstances in Nicaragua that have to do with that. And I'll leave Jenny and John to talk more about that. But if you compare the two rates, Nicaragua is still much lower than Honduras, and for good reason.
I think the other thing did you want to say something, John?
Jenny?
I think the other thing that we've seen is that in terms of our advocacy work in Congress, one of the major points that we were able to make was the fact that there have not been large flows and massive exoduses of people from Nicaragua coming to the United States. There haven't been caravans, people leaving on foot without anything, or people sending their children over, just putting them on the other side of the border with a little address safety pin to their shirt, saying, this is the best I can do for my children, is put them on the other side of that border because there's no possibility to exist. That's what was happening with the Hondurans. And we hadn't seen that. And so that was one of our advocacy points. If things were so bad, how come people aren't leaving? People are not making that decision where they are en masse from Honduras. And then we started around the elections when things really ramped up in terms of US squeezing Nicaragua and putting on sanctions. And we started to see this new headline that said people are leaving Nicaragua. And what we can see from talking to people who are leaving is that this is also accompanied by some type of program that facilitates their entry. So when they arrive at a point of entry, people that are working on the border say they are passed through and others are held in Mexico. So the Nicaraguans are facilitated entry. And then in Nicaragua, on the cell phones, there's all this very slick advertising encouraging people to come to the United States, saying there's all kinds of jobs available and giving profiles of the jobs that are available and how much money you can be making and encouraging people to come. And so there are policies and practices that were put into motion, again, a policy and a media strategy to encourage people to leave. And the reasons for people making that are different, but one factor that we definitely felt was leading up to the elections in 2021 was people were concerned. We had gotten this US leaked document from the embassy about different contingencies in the event that a regime change operation was successful. Sanctions, there's memory of people living through war and economic embargo and not wanting to live through that again. So again, that use of trauma and threats and pressure to scare people. And that could be one factor. And then I'll pass it over to John.
Just to add one other factor, which is that there's been a long-standing kind of symbiotic economic relationship between Nicaragua and Costa Rica, but this broke down with the pandemic. So people who would be able to work in Costa Rica are finding that the jobs aren't available. They've returned from Costa Rica. And so the US has become a more attractive alternative. Of course, this is now being portrayed by the US administration as people fleeing from communism. But that's absurd. Yeah. That's why people are leaving, whatever they might say when they reach the border and talk to US border officials.
I'd like to point out that for the United States, foreign policy and the immigration policy are closely related. I mean, it sounds obvious, but there's a precedent for this. You know, in the 1980s, when the Cuban boat people came over, they were accepted. There was an exception made for them by the Congress to allow them in the country easily to live here. And, whereas when the Haitians came over as boat people, they were turned back. The reason for that was because we wanted to embarrass the Cuban government, Fidel Castro's government, and to say that these thousands of, Cubans are fleeing this dictatorship. Whereas in Haiti, which was, one of our friendly countries with Duvalier, that we send them back. There's also a racial component to that too. But so I see the parallel here today. We want to embarrass the Nicaraguan government by fomenting the idea that thousands of Nicaraguans are leaving the dictatorship. Whereas in Honduras, we don't want to admit all the Hondurans. And I do expert witnessing the Honduran asylum cases. And, the system is broken, and there are so many Hondurans who are seeking asylum. Most of them will not receive asylum in this country because we don't want to embarrass the Honduran government. Now, if the Xiomara Castro government becomes more like the Daniel Ortega, the Sandinista government, we might start, fooling around with that too. Yeah. But our foreign policy and our immigration policy are closely related.
Okay, we have a quick question. I think it's a quick question regarding the former president of Honduras, Hernandez, JOH, who will be going on trial. And the question has to do with how do you think that the U.S. is going to deal with this contradiction, given that they bolstered him for a long time? Who would like to address that? Jenny?
Who wants to? I can say a few words, and then Jim and John can join me. But I think, number one, again, the media is spinning this as, the U.S. is now swooping in to do the right thing and extradite this narco, without the other part of the story, which is that this now narco who they've extradited has been consistently the number one ally of the U.S. in the war on drugs, according to the State Department. So that contradiction is not explored by the media. And I think that the Southern District Court of New York did start prosecuting and has decided to stay with the evidence and to continue prosecuting. And that when that became clear, it became problematic for other parts of the US government. And that as this big operation became public, Juan Orlando became more of a liability going into that election. And so the solution was to remove him. But during all of that time that this operation was going on, the movement of tons of cocaine into the United States, the US was aware of that. They knew about it. It was not a concern until it became too much of a liability because of the work of the court that surfaced it, and because of the work of the Honduran people who have been denouncing this and talking about this for all these years. So I think it remains to be seen now what's going to happen. And I think, John, you had one theory about Noriega being a possible instructive example of what may happen. But the main thing is the US is not playing a heroic role in terms of extraditing him. He was the ally right up until the end, and until it became very inconvenient. And the US was not unaware of what was happening.
Just to add, Manuel Noriega in Panama was a CIA asset for many years. Then he turned politically and started supporting the Sandinistas. And the US went into Panama City militarily in, I think it was 1989, correct me if I've got the date wrong, and killed anything up to 4,000 people in order to extract Noriega from Panama and put him in prison in the US for many decades. So unfortunately for one Orlando Hernandez, I think that's what's going to happen to him.
I'd like to add that the extradition of Juan Orlando is part of that cleanup operation, which the United States has to do. But I've heard a lot of Hondurans. There's a narrative going around that I have heard in Honduras that this whole it's just a shame and too bad that the United States had to step in to do this, that the Honduran courts and the Honduran government couldn't do it themselves. Why couldn't we Hondurans take care of our own president and deal with him here? Why did the US have to shape in? Now we can look at that from another perspective and say, well, this is another example of the US statement that it is still in control of Honduras. Yeah. We are in control of the Honduran government. We can pull out presidents when we want to and extradite them. You can take a look at that too. There's another level to that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I think this may be the final question, and then we'll give each of you a chance for any last words. But this question is, can someone address the establishment of special economic zones, ZEDE, I guess it is, in Honduras? And the person asking this says, I see these in Honduras as a model for corporate control of a portion of a state's territory.
Right.
And this person saw that there's even a more extreme model of that in Ukraine, as an entire state is now subject, with all labor organizing outlawed, etc. But anyway, if you could address how this is going on in Honduras. Thank you.
You want to speak to that, Jim?
Well, there are, my understanding is right now there are 3 of these zones of special development, ZEDEs, in Honduras. 3 of them have been concessionated, shall we speak. They are basically enclaves which are supposedly independent of Honduran law, primarily Honduran courts. They have their own courts, their own systems of, basically they're states within states. And so, the Honduran Supreme Court, back in whenever they started, declared this unconstitutional because it's a violation of Honduran sovereignty. But that court was basically replaced by a new court which approved the whole thing. So under the Juan Orlando Hernandez government. These are enclaves which, if you want to look at the unfettered neoliberal model of development, in which the economy and the making a profit by private industry trumps everything else, these are good examples of that. They take the land and and some of the resources. And the other piece of this is that the original plan was to develop these model cities, as they're sometimes called, on zones that were uninhabited, which meant basically that they were inhabited by thousands of indigenous people who really didn't count. It didn't matter. So we have them basically in areas of high indigenous population in Honduras, or in the case of Roatan, it's the Black population of Roatan who are dealing with this. So there's just a couple of examples of that. Oh, and what's happened right now is that the Xiomara Castro government has attempted to repeal the law that allows this to happen.
Right.
To repeal the law, the ZEDEs law, has run into a big problem because the people who run the ZEDEs, the corporate interests who run them, have threatened to sue the government for breach of contract. Here again, we have the question of whose rights are we dealing with? So that's where we're at, I think, right now with this.
Yeah, I think just to add to what Jim was saying, when the ZEDEs first started to appear as a thing in Honduras, I remember Hondurans saying this is a laboratory. They want to see if they can make this happen here. And then it could happen to establish a precedent. And it's sort of something from science fiction, but it is a model city, which the country cedes territory, a whole piece of territory, to this group of investors, which then owns the territory, creates their own city that runs their own municipal services, their own governance structure, their own legal system, their own security system, and decides who lives in that city. And it's sort of an extreme expression of this neoliberal liberal economic theory. And a lot of Hondurans think Honduras was a laboratory to try to establish this. And as Jim was saying, Xiomara Castro's, once she won the election, she did a popular consulta throughout the entire country with sectors. And the consulta, which then turned into her policy, her 22-point initial governance plan. And that popular consulta yielded up, repeal the ZEDES, get rid of them, and we don't want them. And so that was at her inauguration part of her 22-point governance plan that she read out, that she will repeal the ZEDES, and that law was repealed. So, but as Jim was saying, they are protected by investors' rights and laws, and they can sue the country for being expropriated. So this is the battle that she's in right now. And this has gotten very tense just in recent days because there was some very tense exchanges between the foreign minister of Honduras and the US Ambassador Dogu, because she went and had a public meeting with the owners of the ZEDES, who have now been, according to Honduran law, told that that entity is not legal anymore. She went to meet with them, and that was protested by the foreign minister. And she answered back, well, we always meet with private investors. We want to know what their concerns are. So this has been very tense the last few days, very Twitter storms between the Honduran foreign minister and the US ambassador about ZEDES.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I think at this point, we are nearing the close of the webinar. So I'm going to ask each of the speakers if you have any final thoughts or words that you'd like to add. Maybe we can go in the order that you spoke, of Jenny, then Jim, then John, and then Nan. Can you close out? No? Okay. All right. Jenny?
I think I just want to close by thanking you all for this time in this space to really sit down and look at what happened in both of these instances, and look at this common thread of shock doctrine and the role of US policy. I think for us as US citizens, that is our responsibility. And I think that these spaces are needed. We need to continue to deepen our understanding, and we need to be active right now to intervene and to complicate ongoing efforts to do shock doctrine, regime change, coups in Nicaragua and Honduras, because it's ongoing.
We have to be careful about what we read. So that there's a lot that is out there in the media, as we've talked about, that is misleading, to say the least. And we have to be a little careful about that. A lot of us, don't have a lot of time to research all of this. So, but to be a little careful about what we read is important. And I think the other thing I mentioned is that when we talk about things like immigration policy, and how we deal with that, remember that immigration policy is again shaped by foreign policy interests as well. What concerns me primarily, in large part, is the fracturing of solidarity with Nicaragua. That is, in the United States and Europe, and the use of these NGOs and religious organizations and others who carry now tale, a kind of mythological tale about what happens in Nicaragua. And the fact that so many people that some of us knew from the 1980s who were so supportive of the revolution are now no longer supportive of the revolution. I think what we need to do is remind people that the revolution is not Daniel Ortega. The revolution is a much bigger issue here, and that the United States is after Ortega, but what I think it's really after is to destabilize and end this the revolutionary experiment that Nicaragua has been engaged in for so many years now.
I think that we need to, I agree with both Jenny and Jim. And I think we need to remember that these are two adjoining countries, with one trying to do what the other has already been doing. So Honduras is trying, with all of the difficulties it faces, to do what Nicaragua's been doing for the last 15 years. And there is already a lot of low-level contact between the two governments. The Vice Minister for Tourism was in Nicaragua, I think, only a few days ago. And, you know, this cooperation between the two progressive governments should be reflected in our solidarity work. Those who are in solidarity with Honduras are excited by Ziamara's government and helping Honduras face these challenges, these enormous challenges, should also pay attention to what's going on in Nicaragua and try to get behind the media headlines and continue to support Nicaragua in the way that many people did during the 1980s.
Yeah.
Thank you all. I think I would just like to add one thing to what Jim said, which is that the Nicaraguan government is not just Daniel Ortega, although I think he is an inspiration to many. But Nicaragua is a very participative country. And you see that very strongly when you visit there, that people are involved in every aspect of what's happening in the country. And that's how the revolution there is being created over time. And people are excited about it, actually. They feel good about they feel proud of what they see. All right, so thank you, everyone. And I'm going to stop the recording now.